Good evening, everyone. My name is Alicia Barrett. I am the wine educator at Binny's, and tonight I have the pleasure of being joined by Jim Clarke of Wines of South Africa, USA, and the author of the newly released book, The Wines of South Africa, which he just finished up last summer. So I do encourage you, if you find great interest in the wines tonight, to check that out. Of course, covering an entire country's wine production in just 30 minutes is quite the task, but we are going to give it our best shot. So Jim, thank you for coming on and helping us navigate the history, the geography, the people, and of course, the wines of South Africa.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
For those of you watching, go ahead and pour yourself a glass of the Graham Beck Method Cap Classique sparkling wine. That's one of the best parts of talking about wine, being able to taste along. And if you have any questions or comments along the way, please put those in the chat function or the Q&A function of Zoom. We'd really love to hear from you. So with that, Jim, I'll turn it over to you to, we'll start with the Method Cap Classique with the Graham Beck, and then I think you have a few slides prepared for us as well.
That's right. Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit of what you have in your glass so you can sip on that, and then we'll take a brief bit of time travel and do a little bit of the history, and then kind of show the landscape of South Africa and what actually makes the wines great and gives them their character today. So what you have in your glass is the Graham Beck, the Brut Rosé. Now, Graham Beck is our, if not our leading, certainly one of our leading sparkling wine producers in South Africa. And this is exciting. It's a category that actually is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. So the very first traditional method sparkling wine, that is a sparkling wine made using the same techniques and approach as champagne, was made in 1971 by a producer called Simonsig. And Graham Beck was actually was a businessman who made his money in other things, and then he was very into horse breeding. So he came to an area of the winelands called Robertson. And Robertson is notable because it has limestone soils, which is pretty unusual in South Africa. And limestone is actually good for breeding horses because it builds calcium in their bones if they feed on grass that's grown in limestone-rich soils. That's his original interest. But he ended up buying the adjacent farm that had vineyards and decided that he wanted to make bubbly. And so the brand has gone on to become one of the leaders. And so we're doing the regular. For some reason, I thought we were doing the rosé.
Well, both are fantastic wines, so we can.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. They're both are.
We can speak to both. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And both are actually very popular in this. It's a leading brand in general, but here in the U.S., they are by far more than 50% of the traditional method sparkling wine from South Africa that's sold in the U.S. is Graham Beck, and those are two of the top 10 wines right there for South Africa. Now, what they did is if you think of the South African history, apartheid meant that there weren't a lot of wine exports leading up till 1990. There was embargoes, people were boycotting South African products and helping to push for the end of apartheid. Well, in 1990, Nelson Mandela was released, and in 1991, most of those embargoes started falling. That's when the US started accepting South African imports for the first time. And so in 1992, they really thought, well, we need to have a name for these wines, these traditional method sparkling wines, that doesn't ride on the coattails of champagne. This is a problem we have here in the US, where you'll see something that's labeled California champagne, and it makes the French very upset. Well, the South Africans had an agreement not to use French terms going back to 1935. So they came up with something that it's French words, but it's not French geographical wine words. So it's not chateau, it's not champagne, it's method. Cap means cape, because we're coming from the Western Cape, the Cape of Good Hope, and then classique is classic. So it's the classic method from the Cape. And these days, most people just call it Cap Classique. And it's the fastest growing category in South Africa. It's a fantastic value because you're moving up a big level over Prosecco, where when you move into that traditional method, you get that time. I don't know how familiar people are with the champagne process, but the wine ages on its lees, which gives it some character and texture to the wine and makes it more full-bodied, and just adds a lot more interest compared to if they did this all inside a tank. So having that method, but getting this at a price that is, half the entry-level price for buying a bottle of champagne means you can have the champagne method bubbles. Here we are on a Thursday night. It can be a day-to-day drink, and certainly is around my house. So Graham Beck's the leader. This one, the rosé, is about 2/3 Pinot Noir, and then the rest is Chardonnay, and then the regular brut is about half and half, about 55-45. And those just as in Champagne, those are the two major varieties that you have in Cap Classique production in South Africa, though they do allow other varieties.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, sorry, Jim, just to
mhm,
underscore your point here, we're talking Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, which we find traditionally in Champagne. We're talking limestone soils, which, as you mentioned, is quite rare in South Africa. And
mhm,
what's so unique is that oftentimes when we head inland and go to Robertson, we find, great value wines and a hefty amount of production. But it seems, Grandbeck was able to find this really special place there,
mhm.
that that they're producing such sophisticated sparkling wines. And you're right, this is on our shelf for $18.99.
Yeah.
So great complexity. And can you also speak kind of the collection of producers that are adhering to the Method Cap Classique rules?
Mhm.
They're continuing to strive for better and better quality. And
Yes.
in terms of time, can you just speak to time on lease? And I think is it as of this coming year that they're going to be required now? That's going up to 12 months, I believe, right?
That's exactly right. So for a long time, the basic requirements have been in place since 1992, and it's time on the lees. It has to have a second fermentation in the bottle, all the things we normally expect. But they do allow different grape varieties, though, as we say, the majority of them now are focusing on Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. The lees aging, they're moving from 9 months, but as of this vintage, which just started a couple of weeks ago, it now has to be 12 months. And quite frankly, most of the quality producers will do more than that. Like this wine is, the Grandbeck non-vintage wines usually are 15 to 18 months. And then even their second tier wines, it's about 40 months. So you can get top tier wines from South Africa that have been aged for 5 or 6 years on the lees, still at prices that are the same as would be a non-vintage wine from Champagne. So a lot of that is there's over 200 producers, and as more and more producers embrace the category, they want to make sure that they maintain that high level of quality. So having these rules in place is not just arbitrary; it's going to keep everyone on the same page. And they have a huge training program within South Africa to kind of work with wineries who are new to the category and say, look, if you're going to make a bubbly, let's make sure you do it right, and let's maintain these high standards across the board, so you can trust the Cap Classique category, whether it's Grandbeck or some other producer you've never heard of. You know it's in good hands that way.
Yeah. And for those of you tasting, we'd love to hear your thoughts. We have a couple comments and a great description too that was put in the chat function, which is so accurate. The bubbles are really tight. The mousse is quite fine. It's not kind of aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
The bubbles don't pop quickly in your mouth, but really linger. And yeah, just tons of that orchard fruit that you kind of come to expect. The apples and the pears, a nice kind of really ripe Meyer lemon, a little bit of stone fruit too, but just a really fun yet sophisticated sparkling wine to dive into. You're right, on a Thursday night for 19
Yep.
bucks.
Yeah. Alicia, do you want to I see we're getting some questions. Do we want to address those as we go, or save them to the end? What would you prefer?
Why don't you go ahead and answer the one that's in there, because it's related here to the Grandbeck, and then we'll move on, and I'll ask them of you as they come up and as
Okay.
they're relevant. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I see a question about these wines, whether they're organic or biodynamic. None of these four are. However, you'll see if you have the bottles in front of you, they all have the capsule on them that has a little strip on the capsule that has a stylized protea on it. And this is what they call IPW, and this is South Africa's sustainability system. So this is a system they developed starting in 1998. And as with the Cap Classique, it's rules that they've been tightening and adjusting ever since to make them more rigorous and more address really the needs of what's happening in the vineyards. So 96% of the industry is certified sustainable now, which is more than any other country. Most countries don't even have a national certification system for their wineries. It's usually done kind of region by region. So this is something South Africa is very dynamic in, and a lot of that does include limited use of pesticides and things like that, which actually you don't have to use much, because when we talk about the climate in South Africa, nice dry summers, they don't get a lot of rot, and it's very windy. And that means like the spores of molds and things like that never even get a time to settle on the grape and infect the grape, infect the plant. So they really have very low disease pressure and don't really need to do too much in terms of chemical use, for example. And then the rest of sustainability addresses things like water use, which is obviously terribly important in the Cape. I'm sure most of you have probably heard about the drought that they had from about 2015 to 2018, there was a point where they thought that Cape Town itself was going to run out of water for people. So water use is really important in the Cape. Now, fortunately, past couple winters, very good rainfall, so the reservoirs are full again. But in the long term, that is one of the big side effects of climate change in South Africa that they're going to have to cope with, especially as more and more people move to Cape Town.
Just, real quick on that, I know that's a topic everyone generally asks about and is concerned with. Do you find that due to water shortages, are producers trying to, is there more investment basically in the cooler sites as a result of the warming temperatures? Is that kind of the best way right now for the wine industry to kind of deal with that?
So there's definitely more interest in cooler sites as you go, in particular down the coast, so where they have that maritime influence, or more recently, we're seeing producers who are looking at higher elevation vineyards further inland. And basically, you lose about 1 degree Fahrenheit for every 100 meters that you go up. So I'm combining metric and our system, but it's a good number, so that your average temperature really does go up dramatically once you get up to 1,000 meters elevation or even 700. So
sure,
yeah.
Sure. Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, so I know you have some photos for us to bring us to South Africa since we can't physically go there.
Okay, so let me go into the share screen mode here.
And again, for those tasting the wines, the next wine we're going to talk about is the Mulderbosch Chenin Blanc.
Okay, I think everyone should have the same thing. There we go. So yeah, here's the 4 wines, and the order I kind of think is probably the best to taste them. If you are really jonesing for a red and you want to move ahead, you know where to go. But we'll come back and talk to these individually as we go through the slides, or actually at the end of the slides. So let's start off with a bit of history. While South Africa, in terms of the U.S. market, is relatively new, as I said, there really were very limited exports here until after the end of apartheid in the 1990s. It's a country with a really deep history of winemaking. And it goes back to the Dutch arriving in 1652. The original purpose of Cape Town, the colony here, was to be a refreshment point for Dutch ships that would stop there and take on water and produce and things, and actually wine, and then they would sail around the southern tip of Africa out to the Far East to bring back spices and textiles and that sort of thing. And from the very first, the first commander of the Cape, a man named Jan van Riebeeck, thought that vines would be suitable to this place. So he asked for cuttings. They put their first cuttings in 1955. And then we actually know the birthday of South African wine. We just celebrated it earlier this month on 2nd of February, 1659, when Jan van Riebeeck wrote in his journal, "Today, praise be to God, wine was made for the first time from Cape grapes." And they've been making wine ever since then. So this is the 362nd harvest of wine in South Africa. Now, pretty quickly, at least one of the wines, a few of the wines, but led in particular by one, became famous throughout Europe. So here we have Napoleon. So you've got a classic French guy. We know he loved champagne. We know he loved Chambertin, but he also really loved South African wine. And we know that when he was in exile in Saint Helena at the end of his life, he had a standing order that used up at least 1/3 of the Constantia wine that was produced. Now, Constantia was an estate that it's now actually basically a suburb of Cape Town. The town has kind of grown around it. But it was an estate originally founded by Simon van der Stel, who is the first governor of the Cape Colony. He was the 10th commander, but then they made him governor because he did such a good job. And the idea is his estate would be a model estate for the estate of the farmers further inland. And he had owned vineyards back in Holland, which we don't think was a wine growing country, but at that period, there would have been vineyards through parts of Holland. So he actually knew something about how to grow vines, how to make wine, and he really kind of raised the quality level overall and created rules. You can't harvest too early. You need to use clean barrels, things like that. Things that are obvious today, but at the time would have been unusual and probably not very well known to the Dutch, since, though as I said, they did have vineyards, they weren't a major wine producing country. Shortly, actually around the time he was taking over, they did get some help because about 200 French Huguenots arrived between 1688 and 1690. In a few years before that, the French had ended the Edict of Nantes, which promoted religious toleration in France. So these were Protestants, and they were facing persecution. So they turned to the Dutch, who were also Protestants, and the Dutch said, well, yes, we've got this new colony. You're welcome to settle there. And it was only about 200 people, but that was 1/4 of the European population of the colony. So it really did have a lasting influence. And some of those French people did come from wine growing areas. So they brought some expertise with them. The Constantio wine had some ups and downs. South African wines had ups and downs through the 19th century, largely tied to British tax policy. So if there was, if the taxes were high on Portugal and France, then South Africa did better. But if everyone was a level playing field, then the South Africans had to export their wine further, and that made the wines less competitive. So it was a real up and down period. Finally, in the 20th century, for a long time, the industry was controlled by an organization called KWV. And it in basic form, is what's called a co-op, where the farmers grow the grapes, but they turn them into, as a group, they vinify them together, and then this organization would parcel them out to merchants who would create brands and things. But in the 60s and 70s, you really saw the rebirth of the estate model that we have today, where, many people, they grow the vines on their farms, they make the wine themselves, and it's their brand. And certainly everyone we're looking at today, that's what we're tasting today. So from the 1990s, there was a big catch-up period because South Africa had really specialized in that kind of off-dry white wine style that we saw from California back in the 70s. Think of a Gallo jug wine that was a miscellaneous blend of grapes. South Africa did that, and they did it actually very well. They were actually a leader with that style, strangely. But in the 90s, there was a big replanting we had originally 80% white grapes and 20% red. Now it's 55% white and 45 red, which much better reflects, I think, what the vineyards can produce. So that's, since the 90s, that's the first wave of growth within the industry. The export markets really opened things up and really exposed South African winemakers to what was happening in the world of the wine elsewhere. So there's a big learning period. But really, since 2008 or so, we've really seen South African wines take on their own identity. They're not trying to imitate, when we taste a Chardonnay from South Africa today, it is a South African Chardonnay. It is not a South African Chardonnay trying to be a California Chardonnay, or a South African Shiraz isn't trying to be an Australian style Shiraz. So the wines really have their own identity. And it's a great country. Like, I love my job because I'm never going to get bored, because it's so diverse, and it doesn't matter what kind of wine you like, someone's making it in South Africa, because when we look at the map, we'll see that things are really divvied up into all sorts of different growing conditions. So today, South Africa, depending on the vintage, is usually ranked as the 8th to 10th largest producer in the world. This statistic is from 2018, and that, because of that drought, that was a low yielding vintage, so there wasn't as much wine made that year. So we dropped back in the ranks a little bit, but 8 to 10, always in the top 10 for the past 30 years or so. And I wanted to show some pictures because it is just beautiful.
And Jim, where is this photo taken? What wine region?
So this is Stellenbosch,
Stellenbosch,
so, which is kind of the center of the wine industry. And you can see it's just, you have these mountains, and we'll see other pictures like this, but the mountains are hugely important because when we look, I don't want to jump ahead. What they do is they carve up the winelands so you have different exposures. If you have a south-facing vineyard, you're facing toward the ocean, into the wind, and you're much cooler than if you're on the north side, for example. So you're going to grow different things. Then you're going to have different soil types. So all these things, the soils are very mixed, so you can really change dramatically within short distances. I see someone commenting about how big South Africa is. I should say, when you look at the top 10 wine producing countries, when you get past, if you're looking at a graph, when you get past France, Italy, and Spain, it drops off quite a bit. So overall, there are 92,000 hectares of vines in South Africa. And I'm sorry, I'm so used to metric. That is about 250,000 acres, 240,000 acres. To compare that to another country, if you look at Bordeaux, well, Bordeaux is 140,000 hectares. So 50% more vines in Bordeaux or vineyard land in Bordeaux than there is in all of South Africa. So even though it's in the top 10, as you see, the tail of that graph is long. On the other hand, if you compare it to Austria, it's about twice as many vineyards as they have in Austria. There's another small producing country. Let's look at the geography, because I want to delve a little bit more into why there's so many different wines happening here. Wine growing in South Africa is really about one area, the Western Cape. And if you can see my cursor, here's Cape Town. This right here is Stellenbosch, and this is the center of the industry here. And the historic vineyards are all kind of in this area. And then later in here, this area is relatively new, because it's that area we were talking about where they're going down to the coast, where they're getting more freshness because of that maritime influence. But it's all in this area. And this is because this Western Cape province has different weather conditions than the rest of South Africa, and really the rest of Africa, until you get to the Mediterranean Ocean. And it is what they call a Mediterranean climate. And aside from meaning that it's warm and pleasant and just sunny and beautiful, it also means that the rainfall comes in the winter. You get wet, chilly, but not freezing winters. So the rain comes then, and then it's dry through the spring, summer, and autumn. And that's fantastic, because you never get that rot in the vineyards if you don't have rain happening during the growing season. Especially in that January, or for South Africa, January, February, you don't want it coming around harvest. So that's why this area is perfect for wine growing in that sense. What you really need to do is just make sure that the soils will hold that water that falls in the winter, so the plants can access it through the course of the summer. So when we break this down into some geographical components, the soils, as I mentioned, these are important. They need to hold that water. Fortunately, most of the soils do have a substrata of clay, which really holds water very well. The soils in South Africa are the oldest viticultural soils in the world. Doesn't make them any better. I know New Zealand likes to brag that they have the youngest. It just means you have a different structure to the soils. And that's the most important thing in soils for vines, is how the vines will grow through them. Will they hold water? If they hold water on the top, then you get rot. You want it beneath, where the roots can access it and suck up nutrients with it. So what happened was, about 900 million years ago, when the planet looked, this is before Gondwanaland, when all the continents were totally unrecognizable to us, but what is now this part of Africa, developed shale soils. So you had this base of shale developing out 900 million years ago. And then from 633 to 500 million years ago, there was a lot of magma moving underneath that, and that pushed up and punched holes through the shale, creating what are called plutons, like granite domes. So, because when magma cools, it becomes granite. It only becomes volcanic when it bursts out. So you get these dome shapes, and you can see those in some of the pictures here. Then that subsided again, and sandstone formed. Well, this was like underneath an ocean. So you had sandstone on top of the granite, on top of the shale. Then that all got pushed up 250 million years ago, and it's been exposed ever since. So it has been eroding ever since. You have this very fine clay from that long, long erosion. So when you look at soil descriptions, if you look at a winery website, it'll usually say like decomposed granite. That means granite that's been broken down for a long time. It's not quite sand, but it has the chemical structure still of the granite, but it is very crumbly. So those three soils, the granite, the sandstone, the shale, are the major wine growing soils in South Africa.
And those soils, Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, especially in kind of recent years, have been used for a lot of these really old vines, a lot of dry farming as well that we're seeing, and a lot of the not just kind of even high end, but just really high quality wines coming out of the country that it's, again, because of the water retention that we see, and really complex wines as a result. So
yeah, old vines produce less grapes, but they produce more concentrated flavor and often better balanced grapes. And we also, talking about climate change again, these vines have been through so much that they're actually teaching us how to grow the vines better, because we see how they've adapted to the years of drought and things like that in a way that young vines don't. It's like they have experience to show us. And that's become a real valuable thing that they're really promoting in South Africa, is to preserve these vineyards. It used to be that the farmers would say, well, we're going to rip up the old vines because they produce less. But now we're saying, no, they're less but better, and you can get a better price for those grapes. So keep them in the vineyard. And that's become a really important trend in South African wine for keeping the industry thriving.
Well, and sorry, Jim, one question that's come in while we're kind of looking at the vineyard here. Question: around the world, vineyards have to contend with birds and bears, etc., eating grapes. Are there any local animals that show particular interest in eating grapes?
Yeah, my favorite story, when I first trip to South Africa, I was talking to an Australian winemaker working his first vintage at one of the wineries out along the coast, and he said, I walked out into the vineyard and there were baboons out there. So, and they were eating the grapes. So I thought, well, I'll scare them off. I'll throw a rock at them. And then he had to make a run for it because they started throwing rocks back. So it's a really unique problem. We don't have it in all areas, but especially in the more mountainous areas, which is where baboons traditionally live. They come down when the vines get ripe and they start eating them. And they're not, they're discriminating in the sense that what happens is they'll come down early, they'll pick a bunch and they'll taste it. And if it's not ripe, they'll throw it in the ground. But they don't put together that if that bunch is bad, maybe they should come back in a week. They'll taste the next bunch and the next bunch, and they'll just keep throwing them on the ground. So they're protected. You can't shoot them or kill them or poison them or anything like that. So what they do is they have people wander the vineyards, making noise, playing music, or sometimes they'll actually use paint guns. And the baboons don't like being splattered with color, so they've learned if they see someone walking around with one of the paint guns, they will leave. So it's a really unique pest to deal with in South Africa.
Yes, though a very natural way to measure bricks, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. If the baboons are actually eating the grapes, then you know they're probably ready. So
yeah.
So looking at the soils, as I said, the soils come from are eroding off the mountains, and here you can see really well. This is Stellenbosch again. That's the sandstone peaks that's still there, and then underneath will be the granite. But all these wavy bits, that's all the stuff that's been eroding off of that over the millennia, and that's where most of the vineyards will be planted. So even this vineyard in front of us, you can tell this is on one of the hills in Stellenbosch, and it's sloping downward from where we are. And the slopes are important, again, because you don't want that water to settle on the top soil. It either needs to drain in or it needs to flow down, and slopes will make sure that it does that. You also get deeper soils up on the slopes, which is great to draw those vines deeper into the clay. If there's anything that really defines South African the growing conditions, it's the wind. There's more, faster, stronger wind in South Africa in the growing regions than in any other wine region. And it all goes to back to a couple things, but the main thing is when summer comes, there's a high pressure system over the South Atlantic that moves under South Africa, and it sits off the Cape, off the southernmost tip of Africa, and it's all this air looking for a place to go. And then the Western Cape, the land warms up much faster than the water, because the water, there's a huge upwelling system here, so the water is very cold. Not only is it basically cycling in from Antarctica, but the water on the top that's warming up actually gets pushed off the coast, allowing the cold water to come up from like 300 meters below. So very cold water. The land, though, warms up. And when the land warms up, that air rises, and then the wind can just sweep in. And so when you see, like in this picture here, this is Cape Town, that's Table Mountain. The winds are coming from the southeast behind Devil's Peak here. And you can see as the winds push into the mountain, the air rises, and then the water in it condenses, and you get these clouds piling over the mountain like we see here. And if this were another photo, we often see in the afternoon on Table Mountain here what they call the tablecloth, which just looks like this white fog just dripping off the side of the mountain. So that really shows the wind. And as I said, the wind helps keep the vineyards healthy. It helps keep them cool. It means that there might be a lot of sun on the vineyards, but the grapes are not getting too hot. So you really feel it. You can be, it seems very hot at 2 p.m. And then as the wind kicks in, then by 7 o'clock, you need a sweater, even in the height of summer. So that's the wind. And we talked about the soils and the exposures in the mountains. Those are really the major factors that carve up the landscape. When we look at what South Africa grows, here's the most recent statistics. And it's great because there's a lot of familiar varieties, but there's still a lot of variety. So if you're looking to try something new, maybe if South Africa is new to you, but you like Sauvignon Blanc, well, you're going to find some great Sauvignon Blancs. If you like Chardonnay, there's great Chardonnay and Cab and things like that. But then there's a few specialties. And I think Chenin Blanc is really a great example of this. This at one point was 1/3 of the vineyards in South Africa. And historically, it actually goes back to this desire to make those kind of off-dry, simple whites that we were talking about, those easy, pleasing but simple white blends. But in the 90s, a lot of that was ripped up, and people said, well, what are we going to do with Chenin now? Is this a quality grape? And they looked at the Loire and the history it has there, and they looked at what they had, and they said, well, we're very different from the Loire, but Chenin does really well here. And if you think of the Loire wines, they often have really sharp acidity, so sharp that you want a little bit of sugar just to round that off, just like you do with a German Riesling. Well, fortunately, Chenin Blanc, even in the warmer growing conditions of the Cape, keeps its acidity. Not to that same degree. It's not going to be that kind of enamel, mouth-watering feeling, but the wines are nice and fresh. So Chenin Blanc can actually grow in warmer parts of South Africa and like parts of Stellenbosch or the Swartland, where normally Sauvignon Blanc, for example, would make a wine that would be really kind of heavy and unpleasant. Same with Chardonnay. So Chenin Blanc really has suited itself to South Africa that way. And I mean, you've got the Mulderbosch in your glass.
Yeah, and just speaking to that, and
Yeah.
for those tasting, I'm sure you still feel again that high acidity, but you feel a nice concentration of fruit here and some ripe fruit expression. We're not just in kind of the orchard and citrus kind of Loire Chenin space that we're familiar with, but we're getting into some riper fruits, even into some tropical and really nice expression. And this producer as well does some lees contact, which gives us a richer mouthfeel. And I think some of it actually sees some old oak. So, I think, there's a Chenin for everyone, I feel like, in South Africa. A lot of different styles, from stainless steel to oak, from lean to round. So this Mulderbosch here is on sale right now for $12.99, and just a really, really pleasant drinker. And if you have it, please feel free to share your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting challenges with, or the challenges or pluses about South African Chenin Blanc is it does come in so many styles. For us, for trying to build the reputation for the variety, it's a little challenge, because if you think of, I mean, obviously, people here, you're interested in wine, you're spending an hour of your evening listening to someone talk about wine. But for people who want that wine that they just pick up when they're doing their grocery shopping, they don't want that variety. They want to know that if they pick up whatever their favorite, I don't want to pick on another country, but for example, if you look at how New Zealand built their brand with Sauvignon Blanc, or Argentina with Malbec, there was a certain consistency of style within, especially that entry-level price point where people first trying out the wines, so that if you bought brand X and you liked it, and you were at another day, you said, well, brand Y of a Malbec or of a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, it's going to be similar enough that you're going to be like, oh yeah, this is kind of what I was looking for. What we find with South African wines is, if you pick up a crisp stainless steel one, and then you pick up the Mulderbosch, you might say, these are a little different for me. I'm not sure what to expect from this category. But on the other hand, if you'd like to explore wine, wow, then you can see Chenin in so many different manifestations. I would say, I think there's kind of what I call the median style. I think the Mulderbosch kind of fits in with this. Yeah. And this goes back to my experience as a sommelier. The median style is just a wonderful wine when you have people getting together. I know we're not really doing much of that right now, but when you've got people with different tastes, oftentimes you find among white wine drinkers, they're militantly Chardonnay drinkers or Sauvignon Blanc drinkers, for example. Well, those two are often going to have a hard time agreeing on a wine. But many of these median style South African Chenins will have enough aromatic generosity to make that Sauvignon Blanc drinker happy, and they're going to give them a wine they enjoy. They've got enough body and roundness for the Chardonnay drinker. And because Chenin keeps its acidity so well, for, say, the Pinot Grigio drinker, there's that freshness. So if you think of a Venn diagram of those three, a lot of these wines are going to fit right in there. So when I was a sommelier, this meant when someone said, hey, I'm having a party of 50 people and I want to have one white wine, I'd say, okay, South African Chenin, let's do that. That's gonna tick the box for everybody.
Yeah, we have a comment here. Mulderbosch has been making super affordable and delicious Chenin for years, so definitely kind of a tried and true producer. They also have we have a rosé on our shelves from Mulderbosch. They have a Sauvignon Blanc as well. So lots of options if you like this producer, for sure.
Yeah, and I haven't been able to seen this historically, because a few wineries claim this, but they were actually one of the first to really take Chenin seriously and actually try, as you mentioned, that part of it sees oak. Originally in the 90s, this wine saw a lot more oak, and they were the first to experiment with using oak in Chenin rather than making just a simple wine from it. So to add added complexity and texture and treat it seriously at a time when a lot of people thought it was just a workhorse grape. Okay, so looking at some other things here, we're not going to taste all of these today, but I'll just point out a few things. One, lots of Sauvignon Blanc. That's actually, with the South African consumer, that's probably the most popular white wine within South Africa. They like to braai in South Africa. It's kind of they call it South African barbecue. It's more like grilling outside because it's not that slow smoking process. But while the coals are burning down, you drink your sundowner, as they call it, and that's usually Sauvignon Blanc. So lots of great Sauvignon Blanc. Chardonnay, a grape that went from zero. There was less than 3,300 vines in the late 70s. Now it's one of the major varieties there, and often in a really great style where not heavily oaked, but with a nice roundness to it. I really think it and Chenin Blanc, you really see the South African passion in white wines for getting wines that have texture and weight without resorting to oak for it, and with good freshness. On the red side, you'll see Cabernet is the leading grape, though Shiraz has been catching up to it. A lot of times these are bottled as blends, and we're going to actually have two red blends coming up, one that's more Syrah based and one that's Cabernet based, so you'll see that today. Merlot also goes into blends. Pinotage, this is a really interesting grape. We're not tasting one today. It has a bit of a mixed reputation not because there's really anything wrong with the grape, but it took a long time for winemakers to learn how to make it. So if you make it like a Cabernet, you can get problems. You have to make Pinotage like it's a Pinotage, and I won't get into all the technical details, but it's really interesting. And nowadays, I say Pinotage is, producers who are making it are serious about it. And then if an importer decides they want to bring it in, they know that they've got to bring in a good one, because a lot of people, this is especially in the trade, a lot of people who remember, wine Pinotage from the late 90s, they're going to taste that and say, they tasted it, and they're not going to know that things have changed in 20 years. So go out and try Pinotage. I know that once it's gone through the hands of an importer, a distributor, or retailer, it's been so heavily vetted, it's the most carefully vetted wine in the shop. I have someone knocking at my door, and it's actually a wine delivery.
You grab that, Jim.
I'll be one moment. Sorry.
Yeah.
You
can't let it go back to FedEx. It's going to be very annoying for you to get.
Excuse me.
But yeah, I'm glad he brought up Pinotage and its evolution in quality, because it really is quite different than it was several decades ago. And this was a variety that was bred in 1925, actually, I think at the University of Stellenbosch, kind of the hub of wine education in South Africa. And it's a cross between Pinot Noir and Cinsault. And while there have been some not so favorable comments about kind of the older styles from years ago, as Jim mentioned, it is something to check out now if you're not familiar. What do we have?
It's a Pinotage. Very well timed.
Day in the life of a wine industry professional there. Wine shipments arriving at all hours.
Yep. Yeah, I didn't. Sorry, I thought my wife was going to be here, and she seems to have stepped out. So anyway, so this is kind of a rundown. You're going to see a lot of other varieties from South Africa that aren't in these, but maybe it's less than 2% of the vineyards, but really interesting things. Pinotage is actually a cross that was made in the 1920s in South Africa between Pinot Noir and Cinsault. And both of those grapes have advocates in South Africa. There's great Pinot Noir coming from the Hemel and Elgin, these areas down on the coast where it's cooler. And Cinsault was really ignored for the past 30 years until maybe about 10 years ago. And if you like Pinot Noir, if you like fresher reds that aren't necessarily like deep in color and powerful, but are great for the summer, Cinsault is a great place to look. And a lot of South African producers are turning back to it in exactly that style.
Quick question, Jim, on Pinotage before we move on. And for those that have submitted questions, I see them and I'll bring them up a little bit later. But one on Pinotage, they asked if it's the only native grape variety to South Africa.
No, let's see. There is a couple other crosses that were made in South Africa. and I'm going to forget some names, but it's the only one that's developed any percentage of plants. There's one called is Chardonnay South African. There's a cross called Nouvelle that was developed in South Africa, but there weren't any native varieties that make proper wine in South Africa when the Dutch arrived. So it is all, if it's not from another country, it was developed from varieties from another country. So crosses and things. Let's see. So I jumped ahead. This is the sustainability seal I was talking about, but we had a question about that. So we addressed that then. As I said, 96% of the industry is certified sustainable. Organic growing and biodynamics are becoming more popular. A lot of times the producers aren't getting certified. And that is because the certification agencies are all European and they charge in euros, and the exchange rate makes it very expensive for South Africans to get certified. So the practices are becoming more popular. The certification is lagging behind. The other thing is if the US has agreed to respect European organic certification for European wines, but for a South African producer, they would have to get certified both by the US system, the USDA, and by the European system if they're selling in both markets, which makes it, again, more expensive. So a lot of them are just like, we're doing it for the vineyard's sake. We don't need the certification to prove anything. We just want to do it for our for what's good for our vineyards and our people.
Yeah, and we find that, around the world where certification is very expensive. And it's also not just kind of a one-time thing. They have to come back and inspect vineyards every, so many years and so forth. So, do a little research, and you can often find on wineries' website kind of their farming practices and a good way to shop and support them, even if you don't find anything kind of more official. But we now have this logo to go off of, and it's a great deal with the producers in South Africa that are doing this sustainability program.
That's actually tied in with conservation efforts in South Africa. And I've got to show a King Protea. This is the national flower of South Africa. The area where the wine growing takes place in South Africa, the Western Cape, is basically contiguous with the Cape Floral Kingdom. And the whole globe, botanists divide the whole globe into 6 floral kingdoms. And some of them are gigantic. From a botanist point of view, the whole Northern Hemisphere essentially is one floral kingdom. Well, the Cape Floral Kingdom, which is just the size of the expanse of the vineyards, basically, is the smallest in terms of square miles, but the most diverse in terms of plants. And 70% of those are endemic. They're not found anywhere else in the world. So this conservation effort is really saving a lot of plants, and with that, the wildlife that lives off them in a real serious way. So conservation is a big part of that sustainability program. That's really all I had for slides. I didn't want to dwell on that. I think it'd be much better to spend time talking about the wines, but I will flip back to the map for a moment because I think it's important to see where the wines we're talking about today are coming from. We mentioned Robertson. Robertson is this shape in here, this purple shape here. This is the Breda River Valley. And then this bit here is Robertson. So most of the grapes in the Grembeck would come from here, though for this wine, they do buy grapes. They have vineyards in a few other areas like Elgin down, Elgin down here, and up here on the coast, the area called Darling. So again, getting that maritime influence, getting that freshness into the wines. Now, the Mulderbosch and the Meerlust are both from Stellenbosch here. And if we zoom in here, we'll actually see Mulderbosch is right in the middle of Stellenbosch. There's a set of hills there. So that's where they're sourcing from primarily, whereas Meerlust is right down by the water, and it's right along the Eerste River. This is the first river, because it's the first river that the Dutch settlers found when they started moving inland. And that means when you get near the water, near False Bay, which is this area right here, and if you think you haven't seen False Bay, if you've ever watched Shark Week, you have seen False Bay, because this is where they get those sharks that breach, that jump out of the water. That's where they film that. Anyhow, when you get by False Bay, so you're cooler, you're getting more of that maritime influence. I think this property, Meerlust, is less than a mile from the ocean. You get also that gravel around the river. And when we think of rivers and then gravel and they're growing wine, if you studied French wine history, you're going to think of Bordeaux. And that's exactly what the Mybergs, who've been on this property since the 1750s, when they made wine historically, they stopped for a little while in the 20th century. When they decided to start making their own wine again, they said, we're going to look toward Bordeaux as a model. And so they grow Cabernet, they grow all the usual Bordeaux varieties, and they also grow some Chardonnay, a little bit of other things, but this is really their focus. So in 1980, they said, we're going to make a classic Bordeaux style blend. And within South Africa at the time, red blends were seen as very lowbrow. They were kitchen sink wines of all just, leftovers being thrown together. But that was the impression they had. So making a blend as a flagship wine was really innovative. And so 1980, they released the Rubicon. And if you know Roman history, the Rubicon was the river that Caesar crossed when he was returning from Gaul. And by crossing it with his troops, he was basically defying the Senate. And he said the die is cast, and it was like, now that's how the civil wars began. That led to the end of the Roman Republic. So it really the idea of crossing the Rubicon is what lent this name. By making a serious blend, I'm crossing the Rubicon, is what Philip Myberg thought when he produced that wine. And it really changed things. This is one of the influence of this wine and other producers around that same era that kind of followed that example, is why you do see more red blends in South Africa than you typically see in New World countries. When we think of California, we usually think, so Napa Cabernet, and there are definitely some really wonderful Cabernet-based blends there, but it's more the varietal thing rather than the blend that is put at the flagship. So this is really unique in that regard.
It is very reminiscent of Left Bank Bordeaux. And, I'm glad you mentioned that cooling influence coming off of False Bay, especially because that kind of nice herbal character that comes with Cabernet Sauvignon, especially when it's picked at the right time, is there. And it's, this is the 2016 and still so much primary fruit, really beautiful wine. This is Cabernet Sauvignon. There's some Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and some Petit Verdot in this. So absolutely beautiful. Jim, I'm getting bombarded with questions here. So I want to start checking some of them off the list.
Okay.
And while we're in Stellenbosch, Hans has asked if you can kind of compare Stellenbosch to Franschhoek nearby, any similarities there?
Yes and no. Stellenbosch is bigger and more densely planted, and Franschhoek, it's hard to see it on the map here, but Franschhoek is this little spot in here. And you get less of that wind influence because no part of Franschhoek is directly exposed to the sea. So especially at the front end of Franschhoek, it's warmer. So you're going to see more Rhone varieties and more powerful styles of wine because of that extra ripeness. Now, as you move into the valley, it's quite a narrow valley with some steep hills. And again, the vineyards go up those hills, and you find vineyards kind of on the floor remain pretty warm, but as they get up on the slopes, you do get warmer cooler growing conditions. So you even find some producers making Pinot Noir. There's some excellent Chardonnay in there. If there's a variety, there's not really much of it, but a variety that Franschhoek's really associated with, it's Semillon, which was actually very popular in South Africa at one point. In the 1820s, it was more than 90% of their vineyards. So there's some really fascinating old vine Semillon in Franschhoek. And it's also become really associated with producing, after Robertson, it's probably the other area that's associated with producing Cap Classique. There's some great boutique Cap Classique producers in there.
Thank you. I'm still just amazed at this mirror list. The Rubicon, I absolutely love it.
Yeah, me too.
Beautiful, beautiful wine. Okay, let me throw one more question at you before we keep going on here. And we talked a little bit about kind of certifications and that in terms of the export markets, but Etienne was wondering here, they grew up in South Africa and kind of remembers beautiful, beautiful wines, and then, comes to the US and goes to a store and doesn't recognize any of the brands and was disappointed with some of the quality that she found. Can you speak to kind of are the best wines kind of leaving the country? Are they staying there? What do you think in terms of kind of breaking into the US market? How is South Africa doing with that?
Well, there's a few challenges. I mean, historically, there was not a big connection between the countries the way that South Africa was connected with Holland and the UK. Until recently, a lot of Americans weren't visiting South Africa, so there wasn't that awareness of the country. And a lot of the early marketing was not very sophisticated. So it was very like the critter labels, and I think, quite frankly, if you see a wine and it's a label and it's got, you know, cute lions on it, it can work for some brands, but really emphasizing that sort of wild Africa thing does not speak to wine drinking. We don't think of you know, uninhabited jungles as places that make great wine. So I think it took a lot of education to get away from that marketing image and really show and have American tourists go to South Africa and see that it's a sophisticated drinking culture. It's a fantastic dining scene. It is not deepest, darkest Africa. So that's a lot of it. On a real nuts and bolts level, there's also Chenin Blanc is really becoming known as the flag bearer, but for a long time, the emphasis was on diversity. And I think it's great that South Africa has so many different things to offer, and it's not going to change. But at the same time, you need to know where to take that first step. And a lot of people didn't know, well, if your messaging is we do everything well, that's a slow road to really convince people. Whereas if you can say, like, I think we're going to see, if you go into a bistro and they're going to have one South African wine because they have a small wine list, it's going to be South African Chenin. And that's going to be the foothold that helps the rest of the list expand, you know, at places, at shops and things that actually carry a great selection like Binny's and things. So finally, the other thing is, if you look at marketing spend, I mean, I don't want to talk about my own budget, but it's arranged in Rand and the exchange rate keeps getting worse. So that means my budget keeps getting smaller. But also it means, well, if you look at the big industries of the world, California, about 70% of the industry is controlled by the biggest 4 companies within the wine industry there. In Chile, it's 90%. In Australia, it's about 60, in New Zealand, 60, 70. In South Africa, it's less than 40%. So we really only have one major company called Distel, which is about 1/3 of the industry. And then of the top 4, the next 3 are less than 2%. So we don't have those companies that have the huge economies of scale to do giant marketing pushes of their own and really insist on getting their wines into every store across the country. So it's a country of medium and small size wine growers. And that means you don't have the same marketing push of having that leadership brand. When we go back, I don't want to pick on Argentina and New Zealand, but if you look historically at how New Zealand got its place in the market, it's because Cloudy Bay made this big investment and then Brancott. If you look at Argentina, it's because of Catena, which make, you know, wonderful wines, and that led the way. Our leading brands, we don't have someone with that. We don't have that gorilla who can come over here and start knocking heads together. We have to do it step by step, little brand by little brand.
Awesome. Thank you. Very thorough answer. Makes a ton of sense. Real quick before we leave the Rubicon, I'd love your view on this, Jim. We have a question about ageability here. So we're now kind of 5 years in. I'd say at least another 5 years. What do you think?
Generally, South African wines, the wineries believe in aging their wines and in making wines that are ageable. So I've had mirror lists from the early and mid 80s. Let's see, last time I was in South Africa, which unfortunately was not last year, but the year before. That were showing very well. So these wines can lay down for quite a while. I would, let's see, with the 16 in the mirror list, it's drinking well now, but another, I think in another 5 to 10 years, you're really going to see it open up and it's going to develop those wonderful tertiary aromas and depth of flavor, and like that. Okay, someone's drinking the 99. That's fantastic. Yeah.
All right.
So should we talk about the chocolate block a little?
We should. Yeah, let's move to that. And
Okay.
And for those that have questions in the Q&A function here, I see them and we will we'll address those too. So just
we can circle back,
tight.
definitely.
Yeah, thank you.
So we're going to move, I'm going to drop the map in a minute, but we're basically moving, we're actually going to a winery that's in Franschhoek, the area we were just talking about. But for this wine, originally this wine was made with some grapes from Franschhoek and some other areas. And then they bought in the mid 2000s, they bought a couple of vineyards up in this area, Swartland. This is this big kind of faded orange area here. Looks like a huge wine growing area, but a lot of that is actually wheat fields. There are mountains, where's my cursor? Here and here and a little bit up here. And on those mountain slopes and the hillsides where wheat doesn't grow well is where the vineyards have historically grown. So while it looks like a huge area on the map, the amount of vineyards it's not nearly as dense with vineyards as say Stellenbosch is. So this area for a long time the wines were just going to the local co-ops. And if you've come across a wine called Goats de Rome, that's owned by a man named Charles Back. And in the late 90s, he tasted some wine from Swartland, from one of the co-ops, and he said, this is actually very good. I'm going to start a project to make Swartland wine, because I think this area is a missed opportunity. And he created a brand called Spice Root, and the wines were excellent. They were made by a young winemaker called Eben Sadi. And a few years later, Eben Sadi went off on his own and introduced his own wines, and those were superb wines and really serious and very boutique and got a lot of critics excited. Well, what happened was you had a bunch of young winemakers, like the winemaker working at Boek en Hoedskloof, which makes the chocolate block, and some other people who said, well, we want to create our own brands. This is an untapped opportunity. We can't afford land in Stellenbosch, but we can afford to buy grapes and rent vineyards up in Swartland. So in the 2007, 2008, you had people like Adi Badenhurst, Mark Kent from Boek en Hoedskloof, the Molyneux, and several others making some fantastic wines up here. And they were making wines that really captured a South African character. I went back to saying they're not chasing the market. They were making such small quantities of wine. They're like, I can make exactly what the vineyard gives me in the wine I want to make. And I'm sure I can find people who want the 3,000 cases I was making at the time. Now they've grown dramatically since then, but you can really see how that attitude now has permeated South Africa, and the wines all taste South African, which I think is fantastic. So Boek en Hoedskloof, having bought those two vineyards up there, decided that these vineyards would actually be great sources for the chocolate block. And it's an unconventional blend. And here I'm going to turn off the map because I can never quite remember the blend statistics. I want to make sure I get it right. Yeah, we're out of sharing. There we go. So this is 69%. Sorry. Excuse me. Yeah, 69% Syrah, 13% Grenache, 9% Cinsault, that grape I mentioned earlier. So those are all traditional grapes that are traditionally blended in, say, the Southern Rhone or other parts of Southern France. So that's a normal combination. But now we're going to add in 8% of Cabernet Sauvignon. That normally doesn't get blended with those other grapes, but it works for them, so they did it. And then they actually use 1% Viognier, which is sometimes used in the Northern Rhone to kind of add some floral aromas to Syrah. Here they're doing the same thing with it in a more complex blend. So the name, the chocolate block, it has the power of suggestion. A lot of people put it to their nose and say, oh yeah, chocolate. It's actually named for the color of the soil in one of the original vineyards. So it's not meant to suggest the aromatic quality. It's actually a description of what the block of vineyard looked like. So.
I'm glad you shared that, because when we were going back and forth on the wines for today. Yeah, the chocolate block can be a little misleading, because actually, though, yeah, I mean, maybe you can find a little bit of that kind of cocoa dusting, but it's a very savory wine, as you would expect, being so led by Syrah and those Rhone varieties that you mentioned. And yeah, the Cabernet even kind of beefs it up a little bit more, but it's all of that like really smoked meat kind of gaminess that you expect with that kind of black pepper and olive. And but it's a food wine, but it's savory, and despite the cab, kind of still a pretty old world but big wine.
Yep.
And with that, I want to tie in a question here with Cinsault in the blend. Melanie asked you can just describe the basic characteristics of Cinsault, as we referred to it earlier, being crossed with Pinot Noir for Pinotage, but now also in this wine.
Right. So Cinsault is a thin-skinned grape with pretty big berries. So that means you get a lot of juice out of it, but you don't get a lot of color, because the color all comes from the skins of the grapes. So it's it tends to produce a red fruited light wine. A lot of people think it's high acid. It's actually not so much high acid as it's not very it's just not very dense in character. So it has this freshness to it that actually comes from the character of the flavoring components more than it comes from the acidity as such. Oftentimes it's used in a blend to kind of lighten up the blend a little bit, to give it, to smooth off some of the rougher edges. And we actually see historically in South Africa, it was often blended with Cabernet, because Cabernet, there wasn't much Cabernet in the 1960s or so. It was less than 3% of the vineyards, but it was very popular with the South African consumer. So they were blending it. The laws were kind of loose about this. And what we find is that it really made what were really tense, very tannic structured Cabernets much more enjoyable when they were young, but also helped them age more elegantly. So a lot of producers today are looking at that again, and there's some of the young hip producers who are looking at those historical wines and tasting them now 50 years later and saying, these are really good. I want to see if I can recreate that style and work with Cab and Cinsault together, for example.
Yeah, awesome. So just kind of transitioning to kind of some straight Q&A here.
Sure.
So a great question here. What is the percentage of Black South Africans that own vineyards? Connected to that, kind of what roles do Black South Africans have in ownership and leadership in the vineyard or winery?
This is something that's obviously been changing a lot, and it's been something that's been worked on since the 90s. A lot of the emphasis has been put on vineyard ownership, but I think it's more important to look at at brand ownership, because the government really focused on land. That's very, very natural, and it's part of it makes sense in other industries. But if you look at the wine industry, the least profitable part of the wine industry is growing grapes. And this is particularly true in South Africa right now. 50% of the grape growers in South Africa, this is before the pandemic problems, which is another story. But even before that, 50% of them were not making a profit. So it's really a disservice to give these vineyards, or not give, but transfer these vineyards to previously disadvantaged groups. And I want to say Black and colored in the South African definition, which is a whole kind of mixed race group with its own history within and very prominent within the Cape. But then say, here's the least profitable part of the industry, and that's what you get. So a lot of the programs these days are helping people build brands, build market skills, and things like that. So of the, we now have 67 Black-owned brands in South Africa. And they range from really models like Aslina, which is the first Zulu woman to become trained as a winemaker. She came from the Eastern Cape, basically got in based on her chemistry degree, but had never tasted wine. And she's gone on to develop this fantastic palate, and she's making really great premium wines that sell for $30, $40 here. Another model, though, would be Bossman. This is originally a white-owned farm. The family still is still involved. What they did is they said, we arranged with help from the government to kind of subsidize the creation of a trust. The workers are now part owners, together with the family, of the whole profit. And they've been so successful. From the very first year that they could construct the trust, they've been able to give dividends to the workers on top of their regular salaries and things like that. And they've grown from, they're up to over 700 workers involved now, with buying a whole new property in different regions so they could grow different grapes. Really dynamic. So you have a lot of different models and a lot of different things. I think the industry has kind of stepped aside from chasing what the government wants and really trying to figure out and let the workers figure out what's best for them. Is it best to be a landowner? Then in some areas, yes, then let's find a way to make that happen. But is it better to get really good jobs or create jobs that are in the wine industry but ancillary to the wine industry? For example, Meerlust, they created a great program for their workers where the workers had a wine logistics company, storing wine, helping doing labeling, helping shipping, things like that. And that's a much more profitable part of the industry than trying to build your own brand. And now that Companies Drift, has the means to actually start building their own brand. So they do have a wine now, but it was the logistics that's given them a solid financial background to make it work.
That's great. Another question that has come in that this person's, read my mind, because I was going to ask you this too, but the South African wine industry has really shown great fortitude and resourcefulness during this exceptionally difficult period. And I want to underscore exceptionally for them. They've endured numerous bans on alcohol sales, along with restrictions on workers in the vineyards, even picking grapes they weren't allowed to do for some time. So can you tell us a little bit about how that's going right now, how winemakers are feeling? Obviously, we can support them by buying their wines,
yes,
but kind
please.
of anything else you want to elaborate in terms of what they've gone through recently?
I mean, I think you covered the major things. There's been three separate alcohol sales bans in South Africa as part of their pandemic lockdown rules at different points. And the idea is, one, to discourage people from getting together, especially in a lot of the township communities. You don't drink alone at home or with your family at home, you go out to drink. And so it just promotes that circulation of people and things like that. The other thing is there is a big alcohol abuse problem in many parts of South Africa, and they find on weekends people go out and drink, and then they're in the hospitals, they're using the medical services which need to be focused on dealing with COVID. So that's been the government's major argument for that. Now the wine industry has said, well, there's other ways to do this. It's been a bit of a fight back and forth. At this point, the bans are over. The rate of new cases has dropped dramatically, so I think we're past it. But for the industry, the big problem is there's now a lot of wine sitting, waiting to be sold, and the new harvest is coming in. And to speak of like those brands you were talking about before, the brands that get sold in bulk. This is still a big part of the South African market, just as it is in California or Chile, for example, where the wine might be sent in tankers to the US or to especially Germany and the UK, and then bottled there and with a brand that you'll never see back in South Africa. Well, none of that wine has found homes. So, and those wineries don't have room to bring in the new vintage. So it's a real challenge, and it means that the grape prices go down, which means those growers that I was talking about have a real problem. The statistics we had looking at in August, this is before the December lockdown, suggested we may lose as many as 80 wineries and 350 growers. Now that's 80 wineries out of about 533 and 350 growers out of about 2,700, to give you an idea of scale. And how many jobs will be attached to that? I don't remember what I think they suggested around 30,000. And there are about 300,000 people who work in the industry in one way or another. So it's a really serious problem. And I don't know, I mean, it's a lot of pressure to buy wine. I don't know, hopefully, some other markets are also rising to the challenge. Certainly the UK, there's been huge support. China has suddenly opened up as a great market because they've put a huge tariff on Australian wines. So that might be an opportunity to move some of that wine. We'll have to see.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really sad to hear, really sad. So on kind of a brighter note, two questions here related to kind of one another, or I'll tie them up here. If you were visiting South Africa and, future time and could only visit one vineyard, which one would it be? I'm going to tie in actually a question I had for you, kind of just your favorite region. What should people be really excited about right now if they were to shop by region? And then on our journey to South Africa, maybe just tying in some local food pairing ideas.
Okay. I think I'll take the favorite region first.
Okay.
First, of course, officially, I don't have a favorite.
Yes, definitely not.
But it really depends on what kind of wine you like. But I'm personally, as a former sommelier, I'm a little bit of an acid head. So I like those really acid-driven wines, and I'm really excited about what's happening going down the coast. So when you go from Stellenbosch and you head southeastward, the first area you get to, Elgin, is actually the coolest climate area in South Africa. Even though it's right next to Stellenbosch, it has these unique conditions. I won't go into it right now, but so you start getting these really great fresh Chardonnays and Pinot Noirs, cooler climate examples of Syrah. And that sort of innovation continues all the way down the coast to the very southern tip of Africa, to Cape Agulhas. So there's a lot of really exciting things happening down that way. Producers like Lismore and Stronfeld and Sane and Hamilton Russell, Paul Kluver, Richard Kershaw, these are all making really interesting wines down that way. So that's an area I always get very excited about seeing, because it's also a very innovative area. There were really very little vineyards there before 1992 because of the way the regulations were structured. In terms of a great winery to visit, God, there's just so many. I saw someone mentioned in the comments Spice Route. The Spice Route's kind of tasting area isn't up in the Swartland. It's right next to Fairview, which is their Parle property, and it is Disneyland for wine drinkers. They also, at Fairview, they make great goat's cheese, so you can have cheese and wine tastings. And you go up to Spice Route, there's also a brewery on site. There's a place that makes, does grappa. There's a place that makes biltong, excuse me. Biltong is kind of a, I hate to say this because South Africans get very bad, but basically a beef jerky. It's a dried beef snack that's every South African, it's what you eat while you're watching the rugby and things. And so they do that on site, and there's all sorts of great facilities. You can really spend a whole day there wandering around, looking at the goats, tasting different things, eating different things, tasting different wines. So that's a really great experience. And then if you like the history, I would say go visit Groot Constantia, which is that original, or one of the original parts of that original estate that Simon van der Stel founded back in 1685. Still making great wine today, just outside of Cape Town too, so very convenient. And food, South Africa dining is great. You definitely want to find a braai at some time, which is, as I said, this outdoor grilling, and it doesn't have to be meat. If you're a fish fan, there's great local fish like snook, which is a variety of mackerel, king clip, which is sort of like a grouper. So wonderful fish that grills really well. And actually Kanoenkop, which is known for their Pinotage and Cabernet and only makes red wine, is famous for doing a snook braai. So they actually, even though they're doing red wines, they do a great fish braai because snook has this great rich flavor to it that works well with their wines. For more fancy stuff, there's great wine bars, and it's just so affordable. I took my family down for my dad's 70th birthday rather, a few years ago. And my mom said, we're going to get an Airbnb so we can cook at home and save some money so it's not too expensive. The first night we got there, we obviously hadn't done shopping yet, so we went out to dinner. She looked at the menu, she looked at the prices, she looked at me, she said, wait, what's the exchange rate again? And I said, well, it's about 14-1 right now. And she looked at it and she put the menu down and she said, well, I'm not cooking this week because it's just such a steal. And for what would get you a glass of wine here I'm in New York, you know, a glass of wine here in New York will be a nice bottle of wine at a restaurant in Cape Town.
Well, there you have it. So excellent food, excellent wine, wonderful people. Jim, thank you so much. And I just want to address the kind of question here about importing more wines from South Africa to the US. I'm sure we would all love to. You know, we need consumers on this side too. So as you buy more, you know, the retailers and on and off premise will notice, and it'll work its way up. So
that's exactly right. The more people see that South Africa wine is moving, the more they'll say they have to have it in their portfolio. So
yeah. Well, Jim, thank you so much for this wonderful exploration. We've had some people on from South Africa even that said they've learned a lot. So thank you for sharing all of the knowledge. And all the wines we tasted are available at your local Binny's, but do check out the entire South African selection that we have, support them, and discover the great diversity that the region offers.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Jim. Have a good night.
Thanks. You too. Bye-bye.